His family had already held a funeral for him when Joseph Beyrle walked out of a German prison camp and headed toward the sound of Soviet guns. He had landed alone on D-Day, been captured, and failed in 2 earlier escape attempts. In January 1945, he broke free again, but he did not hide and wait for the Western Allies to find him. The American paratrooper moved east, crossed a battlefield where either side could shoot first, and asked a Soviet tank unit to let him fight. The question was no longer whether he could escape Germany. It was whether he could survive another army, another front, and the hard fact that his own country believed he was dead. Joe Beyrle had grown up in Muskegon, Michigan, during the Depression. After high school, he entered the Army in September 1942 and volunteered for the Paratroopers. Airborne training demanded men who could step into empty air before fear settled the argument. Beyrle became so comfortable jumping that other trainees sometimes paid him to take their place on practice jumps. The habit earned him the nickname Jumpin Joe. He also learned radio work and demolitions, skills that would make him useful far beyond a rifle squad. He joined Company I of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division, and sailed for England in 1943. Before the main invasion, Beyrle took part in 2 secret flights into occupied France. His task involved delivering gold to the French resistance, not winning a public battle. Those missions taught him the shape of danger in darkness, a low aircraft, a jump into hostile ground, a short meeting, and no friendly line nearby. They also made him one of the few men in his unit who had already entered France and returned before D-Day. Yet nothing about those missions could make the night of June 6th predictable. Thousands of aircraft crossed the channel in darkness, while pilots searched for landmarks through cloud, smoke, and anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft carrying Beyrle's group met German fire, and the men had to leave at low altitude before reaching their planned drop zone. A few seconds of flight scattered a carefully trained company across miles of enemy ground. Beyrle came down near Saint-Cum-du-Mont, separated from the rest of his company. The invasion around him was not a clean line moving inland. It was scattered men, flooded fields, hedgerows, dark roads, and small fights breaking out before anyone understood who controlled the next village. A radio operator without his unit could hear fragments of a plan but could not rebuild the men needed to carry it out. Beyrle moved alone, using the demolitions training that had helped earn him his place on the mission. He destroyed a power installation and continued trying to reach friendly troops, but isolation kept narrowing his choices. German soldiers found him near the church grounds. His battle in Normandy had lasted only a short time. His effort to return to it would consume most of the next year. The Germans moved prisoners away from Normandy, while Allied aircraft and artillery struck roads and rail lines around them. Captivity did not remove the danger of the front. It placed unarmed men inside it. Beyrle saw wounded prisoners forced onward and used tourniquets on 2 men whose legs had been shattered. He was injured by fragments, hungry and exhausted, but began looking for a chance to escape almost immediately. His first opening lasted about 16 hours. He slipped away, moved through unfamiliar country, and then ran into another German patrol. The recapture taught him that leaving a fence was not enough. A prisoner also needed direction, food, distance, and some way to pass through a landscape filled with soldiers checking every road. The next attempt would have to solve all of those problems at once. Transfers carried him deeper into Germany through a chain of camps and interrogation sites. Prison camps were designed not only to hold bodies but to break plans. Men were counted, searched, watched, and moved. Food weakened them. Rumors traveled faster than reliable news. Escape committees guarded scraps of information because one careless route could expose everyone. Beyrle tried again with other prisoners and reached a train, believing it could carry them toward freedom. Instead, the train took them to Berlin. German police seized the escapees, and the Gestapo treated them as possible spies rather than ordinary prisoners of war. Beatings and interrogation followed. They survived and were returned to military custody, but the second failure closed another route and proved that even a moving train could become a cage. While Beyrle was being moved between camps, a different story reached Muskegon. His identification tags had been found on a dead man in German uniform. The body was believed to be his and was buried in France beneath a marker carrying his name. In September 1944, his parents received the telegram that families feared, and a funeral mass was held at St. Joseph's Church. His name went onto a memorial for the town's war dead. Neighbors mourned a 21-year-old who was, at that moment, being hauled through Germany in a prison train. The official record had completed a death that had never happened. Joe did not know the details, but the error would later make even freedom dangerous. A man listed as dead could not simply walk into an embassy and expect to be believed. By the end of 1944, Beyrle was held at Stalag III-C, near Alt-Druitz in the German-occupied East. The front was changing. Soviet forces were coming from one direction, while German guards prepared for the pressure closing around them. Artillery could sometimes be heard in the distance. For a prisoner, the approach of a liberating army could still mean death. Camps might be evacuated. Columns might be marched west in winter, away from rescue and deeper into Germany. Guards might fire during confusion, while Allied bombs could not distinguish a prison compound from a military rail target. Beyrle and 2 other prisoners prepared another escape. This time the goal was not to reach American lines hundreds of miles away. It was to find the Soviet advance before the camp moved them again. In January 1945, the 3 men got out. The winter countryside offered little shelter, and the battle ahead did not recognize them as friendly. Snow exposed movement across open ground. Villages might hold German rear units, frightened civilians, or Soviet scouts arriving only minutes before. One companion was killed, and the escapees became separated. Beyrle kept moving east with little food and no dependable map. He carried no document that could explain him to a Soviet patrol. His American uniform could be hidden beneath prison clothing, lost, or mistaken. German troops were also using deception as the front collapsed. Every step toward the Red Army, therefore, increased the chance that the men he hoped would save him might instead see a spy. Turning back, however, meant returning to the camp or dying between the lines. When Beyrle finally reached Soviet troops, he had to make his identity understood with almost no shared language. He was an American soldier, an escaped prisoner, and a trained demolitions man standing in front of tank crews who had no reason to accept the story at once. He could offer fragments of Russian, gestures, his equipment, and whatever remained of his papers. Yet the broad fact was visible on the map. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies advancing against the same enemy from opposite directions. The Soviet soldiers fed him and brought him to their officers. Then Beyrle made the decision that separates his story from an ordinary liberation. He asked to join the tank unit rather than be sent safely behind the lines. The request was not romantic. A tank column on the Eastern Front lived under artillery, mines, ambush, and air attack. Beyrle had escaped starvation and confinement only to volunteer for another kind of exposure. His radio and demolitions training gave him practical value, while his experience as a paratrooper meant he already understood movement under fire. If stories of men who choose danger for a reason deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Frontline Brief, leave a like, and tell us in the comments whether you would have joined that column or waited for evacuation. The Soviet officers allowed him to continue with them, and the American prisoner became part of an eastbound armored advance. The machines around him were T-34 tanks, built for a war of movement across great distances. Their broad tracks crossed winter mud and snow that could stop trucks. Infantry rode on the hulls until fire forced them down. To Beyrle, the tanks were also shelter, transport, and proof that the prison fences were finally behind him. He traveled with the unit as it pushed west toward the heart of Germany. Sources differ on the exact length of his service with the Soviets, describing a period from roughly 10 days to several weeks. The precise count matters less than the sequence that is firmly established. He escaped a German camp, reached a Soviet tank formation, was accepted into it, and returned to combat before any American official knew he was alive. This was not service in a parade unit moving through empty territory. German forces were still capable of striking hard. Towns, roads, and bridges could be defended. Mines slowed the lead vehicles. Artillery searched for crowded roads, and aircraft attacked columns from above. Beyrle helped the Soviet troops with demolitions and fought beside men whose language he could barely speak. The shared task was immediate enough to cross that barrier. A blocked road, a German position, or a damaged vehicle required action before translation. Food, cigarettes, hand signals, and repeated work created a small practical vocabulary. For the second time in the war, he was moving through German-held ground with explosives. The difference was that the tanks beside him were now coming from the east. The advance carried Beyrle back towards Stalag III-C. The camp that had held him was reached and liberated by Soviet forces. For prisoners still inside, the arrival of armored vehicles meant gates opening, guards disappearing, and the first uncertain moments of freedom. For Beyrle, it closed a physical circle. He returned to the place as part of the force that broke it open. Yet the war did not grant him a clean ending. During the continued fighting, a German air attack struck the Soviet formation. The same kind of battlefield chaos that had scattered his D-Day aircraft now reached him on the ground. Beyrle was badly wounded and evacuated to a field hospital. The escapee who had refused safety was again unable to choose where he went next. At the hospital, his presence drew attention because he was plainly not a Soviet soldier. According to accounts preserved by the National World War II Museum, Marshal Georgy Zhukov learned of the unusual American patient and helped provide the papers needed to move him toward American authorities. The documents were a bridge, not proof. They could carry Beyrle across Soviet checkpoints, but they could not erase the death notice already attached to his name. He traveled toward Moscow with wounds from one front and an identity problem created on another. At the American embassy, officials faced a man who claimed to be a paratrooper listed as dead. War had produced infiltrators, stolen uniforms, false papers, and prisoners whose records had disappeared. Suspicion was not irrational, but it trapped Beyrle in a final form of captivity. He had reached his own countrymen and still could not go home. He was held while the embassy searched for evidence across wartime systems that did not update quickly or agree with one another. The story he told sounded almost impossible. He had jumped into France, been captured, escaped east, fought with Soviet tanks, been wounded, and arrived in Moscow. The official file offered a shorter answer. Joseph Beyrle was dead. Fingerprints finally settled the argument. The man in Moscow was the same soldier who had entered the United States Army in 1942. The casualty record had been wrong because the tags found in France had been attached to another body. Once the identification was corrected, a new telegram traveled to Muskegon. This one did not announce a death. It told the family that their son was alive. The change could not undo the months of mourning, but it restored a future that a mistake had taken away. Beyrle returned to the United States by a long route that took him through Odessa and across the Atlantic. He arrived home in time to see the European war end. The soldier who had entered France from the west and fought back toward it from the east was finally out of uniform. He did not come home claiming that endurance had made him invulnerable. His path had depended on training, repeated choices, other prisoners, Soviet soldiers, doctors, and officials willing to test an unbelievable identity instead of rejecting it forever. In September 1946, Joe Beyrle married Joanne Hollowell at St. Joseph's Church in Muskegon. It was the same church where his funeral mass had been held 2 years earlier, and the same priest presided. The detail sounds written for a film, but it appears in the congressional record because the contrast was real. A building that had held his family's grief now held their wedding. The memorial that had accepted his death faced the living man who had returned from 2 armies. Beyrle later revisited Normandy and stood again near the ground where his scattered war had begun. He died in 2004 at the age of 81 after returning to Toccoa, Georgia, where the 506th had trained. His story is often reduced to the claim that he fought for both the American and Soviet armies. The deeper truth is a chain of decisions: jump, resist, Escape, try again, move toward danger, prove the impossible, and come home. Germany had held him. A casualty report had buried him. Neither became the final authority on whether Joseph Beyrle was still alive.